traditional logic is not, the concepts are, there's three basic concepts. The first concept is understanding. And it's based on what's called a simple apprehension, and the logical term for that, the technical term, is called a term. So we use that. That's an example where the technical and the conventional have some crossover, because all of us know that term, which is from terminus, the end. And it's the same exact meaning in Arabic of had, which is a term, because a lot of these technical terms came from the Greek into Arabic and then into Latin. Most of logic was translated initially from Arabic into Latin until they rediscovered the Greek texts. And you will see words like quiddity, which is not the word that Aristotle uses. It's a Latin term that does not, it's not an equivalent to the Greek term for the same meaning, because Aristotle didn't use, his term meant more like a thing. So quiddity, quid est in Latin, means what is it? That is a direct translation from mahia, which is the Arabic term. That's an invented word by the Arabs. It's a hybrid word. It's what's called a portmanteau word, if you want a specific dictionary term for that type of word. It's bringing two words together to make one word. So mahia means essence, but it's really saying what it is. Mahia, because it could be a question or it could be mahia, what it is. So traditional logic is different from symbolic logic, which is taught in, if you take a logic, how many people have taken a logic course in a university? So what did you do?
Well, it was mostly, to be honest, it was mostly critical thinking. So
Okay, so you did a critical thinking course where they did a lot of the fallacies, the logical fallacies. That's a very common, and it's useful, but it completely removes some of the most important components of logic, which, for instance, definitions, how we obtain a definition, the concept of categories, predicables. It also removes completely the metaphysical distinctions between true abstraction, and I mean there's some really interesting metaphysical issues in logic that modern critical thinking classes don't cover at all. Did anybody else have? So what was yours? Fallacies. Anybody else? Nobody? Yusuf? Oh, okay. And what was yours?
that was over 30 years ago.
Okay. Was it symbolic? Or was it?
Go.
Do you remember? Yeah. That's most of our experiences with education, so it's okay. There's the 5-minute university. You know about that? Somebody back in the 70s said that he was going to open up a 5-minute university to save people all the money of spending 4 years of going to school. He would teach you what you would remember after 5 years. And so he called it the 5-minute university. Because he said, like, if you study with him business or economics, he said, it's basically supply and demand. Because he said if you take an economics course, 5 years later, all you'll remember is supply and demand. His business class was buy cheap and sell for more. So, in most classes that do teach logic, it's usually people that are doing philosophy degrees. And logic is very important for philosophy. And then schools are either Continental philosophy or analytical philosophy. There's, a lot of students don't know this. When they go into universities and I want to major in philosophy, they really don't know that they're often going into a lion's den. They don't know what that school is promoting. Because some schools are promoting empiricism, some schools are promoting rationalism, some schools are promoting more traditional, like if you go to some of the Catholic schools, they're more into epistemological realism and metaphysical realism. If you go to most of the United States, it's analytical philosophy. You'll do a lot of language analyses. You get into a lot of the critical theory that comes in philosophy now, and so you'll be into deconstructionism. Even if you go into humanities, like if people take English degrees, a lot of people will go into this because they want to read good literature, and they really enjoyed reading literature when they were in high school, and they're really looking forward, and then they end up reading literature from a deconstructivist point of view, and you read Jane Austen to study the servants and the marginalized people in the novel, and then it becomes what's the subtext of the novel. You know, a hierarchical British class system where people of leisure sit around making witty repartees amongst each other. And I mean, this is the type of studies that goes on now in a lot of colleges and universities. So logic, unfortunately, traditional logic has almost been completely removed. And the problem with it, here's the problem, is for over 2,000 years, this is what people studied. You know, so it's very odd that this is the foundation of much of the great literature, the great works that we read, whether we read them in Arabic, Persian, French, German, English, whatever language you read them in. If you read Hume, or if you read Locke, or if you read, they were all masters of logic. They're all making logical arguments. And you can't really understand them. Just like, I guarantee you, what I've been reading to you from Ahmed Zarruq, if you haven't studied logic, you wouldn't really be able to understand what he's talking about, because he's working within a framework. And so this is why it's really important to reestablish these tools, because they're valid tools. People were not misled for 2,000 years. It was a very useful tool that enabled people to do certain things. It has its limitations, undeniably. And there have been criticisms, and some of those criticisms are valid, that were made about the limitations of logic. But it's still a very important study, and for that reason, understanding it is very useful. And I guarantee you, after you've studied it, you will begin to see a lot of things that you might not have noticed before, even in your readings. You'll begin to see things. So traditional logic is based on two branches, what's called formal logic and then material logic. So these are the two branches. So I mean, I didn't finish those. Understanding the second concept was basically judgment, and then the third concept was reasoning, and that's logic. So now that's the skeleton. Here's the musculature and the nerves and all of the organs that make it up. But the skeleton is basically those three things. So in formal logic, you're looking at induction and deduction, and deduction is the logic of the Islamic tradition, and certainly of the Western tradition until the 19th century. I mean, Francis Bacon in the 17th century, he was born in the 16th, but in the 17th century, he wrote a book called Novum Organon, and which is an anti-Aristotelian work. And he argued for induction, that this was the only truly scientific means of reasoning, and that deduction was not, that there really wasn't true deduction. It was all induction. And that's a metaphysical perspective, which I'll get into when I get into abstraction. With induction, you have complete induction, incomplete induction, and then reasoning by analogy. The ulama tended to use induction in the usul. So that's qiyas is the type of what they call istiqra. this was the type, in Arabic it's called istiqra as opposed to istintaj. Istintaj is deductive, istiqra is inductive. And so they would do the istiqra. Complete induction is like if you study all of the particulars of a set. So you have a set of things and you study all of them, then you come to the conclusions. That's complete induction. So for instance, if we study all of the land masses on the planet Earth and scientifically we come to the conclusion that they all can bear life, that's a complete induction. But if we say in England in the 16th century, all swans are white, and then some decades later, somebody travels to Australia and they see a black swan, right? Because you have black swans in Australia, right? So nobody knew about the black swan in Europe until somebody went to Australia and said, that looks like a swan. And the other one said, it can't be a swan, it's black. He said, it looks just like a swan. And he said, it can't be a swan, it's black. Right? Because every swan has to be white. This was the understanding. Well, black and white are accidents. They're not of the essence of something. The essence of that black thing was the essence of a swan. And so they had to conclude black swans exist. So it's called the black swan fallacy in induction, which is why induction is probable. It doesn't give you complete knowledge. And there is philosophical arguments that it doesn't really give you knowledge at all. So, and then the second type of reasoning, which is istintaj in Arabic, is called deduction. So if you look like, if any of you read Arthur Conan Doyle, the method of Holmes was what? He always says deduction, but it's actually induction. Right? So he was inducing, not deducing. But deduction is Aristotelian logic, and it's the logic that the Muslims adopted. Ibn Taymiyyah argued against it in Radd al-Mantiqiyin, which is an interesting book. He argued only for istiqra. And in fact, Wa'il al-Hallaq, in his introduction to that book, said that this is clearly his genius that wasn't realized by the Muslims, and it would take the British empiricists some centuries later to realize the great contribution of Ibn Taymiyyah. But I mean, I would argue that they did understand the problems with it, and that's why they actually did not take his approach, but rather this approach. Deduction has categorical reasoning, and categorical reasoning is what we call qadiyya hamliya in Arabic, and that's using, again, simple apprehension, which is a term, and then tasdeeq, judgment, which is your understanding, which is simple apprehension, and then your judgment about it, which is negating or affirming, and then deductive inference from that. And then it also has hypothetical reasoning, which is usually called a shartiyya in Arabic, although they differ on Ibn Sina uses a different term, but because the conditional is one type of the hypothetical. And so you have the conditional syllogism, which is if there's something, then there's something. And that can be disjunctive or conjunctive. So, like in a disjunctive, you say either numbers are even or odd. Right? Something like that. And then you have, so that's basically formal logic. And that's considered the easier part of logic. And the ISAGOGE is more involved in this type of logic. For me, the more interesting logic is material logic, the modes of argumentation, the modes of being, and the modes of knowledge. in terms of the modes of argumentation, they say that there's basically 4 types of argumentation. Judicative, which is what we would call forensic. It's in courts and things like this. It's arguing legal reasoning, legal argumentation. And then dialectical argumentation, which is where you can't really demonstrate something in any absolute way, so you're not going to arrive at something where somebody else has to accept your conclusion, but instead you make your arguments and you try to show yours is the better argument, but very often what comes out of the dialectical argument is some type of synthesis. And this is the great Hegelian contribution to that, the idea of having a thesis, antithesis, and from that comes a synthesis. But this is the basis of dialectic. And then you have rhetorical argumentation, which is what orators often do. So very good orators will use emotion. They'll use fear. Politicians very often use fear. And these are warned about in the books. If you study rhetoric, they actually warn you about, they have a chapter usually on emotions, and they talk about how emotions are very powerful. You can use emotions to rile up a mob. You can use emotions to calm a mob down. If you want to see a great example of that, watch Robert Kennedy's speech to a group of African Americans immediately after Martin Luther King died. I mean, very, very powerful example of rhetorical argumentation, because he completely calmed this group down. In fact, some of them said they actually came to cause trouble, and then after they heard his speech, they just couldn't do it. So, and then you have poetical argumentation, which is the shi'r in the Arabic world is what we would call verse. In the Aristotelian approach, it's more all of creative or imaginative writing. And great authors are very much making arguments. If you read Dostoevsky, if you read, he's got arguments in there. If you read Jane Austen, a book like Sense and Sensibility, she's definitely making an argument for ways of being. Marianne and Eleanor represent 2 different ways of being. And she's making a case for constraint in one, and for the other also to be more open to that. So, I mean, you can debate about what it means, but that's an example of that. And then in terms of modes of being, Aristotle identified 10 ways of being. So, and you have what's called comprehension, and you have what's called extension. These are very important terms that we'll get into later, so don't worry about it all now. But in traditional logic, you've also seen it as connotation and denotation. You'll see it as extension and intention, not intention with T-I-O-N, but S-I-O-N. And so you have substance. So everything is made up of something. It has a material cause. And then you have quantity. You can measure it if it's in the world. It has quality. This is fine wood. Glass has a certain texture. This is very smooth. That's the quality of it. The color is part of the quality. And then it has a relation. So the computer is next to me. That's the relation that it has in terms of its mode of being. Or that's my son, or that's my father. So there's my relation. So relations are relative, right? So the dog is next to the house is also next to the dog. And then you have what's called the position, so how I'm sitting. And this is also a relative. It's an accident, and it's temporary. And then you have time. You're always in time. You can't get out of time. As long as you're a thing, you're in time and you're in place. And you have relations to things. and you have quality, you have quantity, you have substance. This is our reality. This is being in the world. These are the modes of being. And then you have action, which is what you're doing, right? And then you have passion, what's being done to you. Passion here means infi'al in Arabic, if you want the Arabic term. I mean, these all have Arabic terms like the jawhar, the kam, the kayf, the nisbah, the wada', the waqt, the makan, zaman, makan. And then the action is the fi'al, the passion is the infi'al. And then the possession is the what you have, like how you're dressed. Mm-hmm. What's that? Imtilak, yeah. So you have what your and generally this relates to humans. I mean, Aristotle, possession. Later logicians determined this far less important than he would have put to it, but he didn't apply it really to humans, to other things. He applied it to humans, but also it could be applied to horses. The horse is saddled, or to the dog. The dog has a collar. So those are also aspects of it. And then you have, in terms of extension, and these are what those things relate to. So the genus, which is called in Arabic jins, the species, which is called the nu', the difference, which is called the fasl, and the nu' is the genus and the fasl together, the jins and the fasl. So the genus and the species difference makes the species. And then you have property, which is not essential to the thing, but it emanates from the essence. So an example of that would be like one of the properties. I mean, what is the essence? What's the genus of a triangle? Okay. Any other? It's a polygon, right? Yeah. So it's a polygon, and so meaning it has many angles. Polygon. Okay. So what's unique about it? What's the difference from other polygons? It has 3 angles. Triangularity. So that makes the species a triangle. So the genus is polygon, the species is triangle, the difference is triangularity. The property is that its sums equal what? 180 degrees. So that's a khasa. That's specific, because that's not true of a square, right? And then an accident would be that it's isosceles, scalene, right? Equilateral. Those are all accidents. And then you have the division, and then you have the causes. So you have the formal cause, which in Arabic is called the illa suriya, from surah, the form. And then you have the material cause, which is the madda, what it's made up or composed of, al-illa al-maddiya. And then you have the efficient cause, the illa al-fa'iliya, so who does it, who makes it. And then you have the final cause, which is called the illa al-gha'iyya. I'm promising you, don't worry about this. I don't want you guys to, this is too much. It's like, what's he doing? Why is he doing this? It's just, we're just looking at the forest right now. I'm not, even though these are trees in the forest, I want you to see the whole thing. So we're not really focusing on the trees right now. We're looking at the forest. So just enjoy it. And then modes of knowledge. The modes of knowledge are like definition is a mode of knowledge. And the causes are in the modes of knowledge, because the definition comes from understanding these are very important. And they relate also to the gene, species, difference, and property, because that's also related to definition. So that should actually be connected to the one above it as well. And then, so the definition is, it's going to help you to know what it is based on its form. That's how you define something, really, by knowing that's one way of defining it. So a chair has a form that makes it very clear what it is. And that's why even though you see different types of chairs, it's clearly not a table. Now this is a type of table, and that's when you get into like, when you get into division. Because when you get into division, you're looking at the different types of things. Because they're divided into different types. And so this is a microphone, and this is a microphone stand, right? And these are all the ways in which these are the modes of knowledge, how we know things. And then the material cause, this is made out of metal, this is made out of wood, right? This helps us define it. The efficient cause, this was made by a carpenter probably, furniture maker, who knows who made that. And then the final cause is why. This was made to sit on. This was made, it could have been made for ornamentation, but its primary use is for things, to put things on. So this is a side table, and appropriate that it's got these things on it, right? I probably never thought it would have a La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah crescent moon on it, but... And then argumentation. That's one way we come to know things, is through arguing and then division. So I'm not going to go, because I did these. Okay. So that was the forest. So tomorrow we're going to start with the trees, inshallah. Any questions about either of those two? Go ahead. Rania. Okay, good point. When we say, there's a hadith in, I think it's in al-Bayhaqi, I'm pretty sure. Now they've got these search engines, they can find it immediately. But there's a hadith in Allah, خالق كل صانع وصنعته, that Allah makes every صانع, every maker, and what He makes. In Mauritania, when they first introduced the car and the Mauritanian Bedouins saw airplanes, they were a little overwhelmed by them. And one of the Mauritanian ulama said, إن الوتى في الفلاة حيث يجري يجريه ربنا عظيم القدر كذاك الطيار حيث طار يطيره الإله لا نصارى. So he said, like, you know, the wata, they called it an auto, you know, so it's wata. إن الوتى في الفلاة حيث تجري. The car in the desert, when you see it going, and the plane up in the air, when you see it flying, you know, it's Allah who made them run, not the Christians. So that's basically the idea behind that. So we would say Allah is indeed the fa'il, in haqiqatan, but we're in the world of asbab. And so majazan, we say, just like the Prophet is a shari'u, majazan, haqiqatan ash-shari'u huwa Allah. The lawgiver is Allah, but we call the Prophet the lawgiver because he's the means by which the law came to us. So the same thing, the carpenter is the maker. But in reality, it's true, the maker is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The illa gha'iyya is why you're making it. It's called the teleological. It's the why of the thing. And for Allah, there's no illa gha'iyya. Our mutakallimun negated that. All of these don't, you know, they don't apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They apply to the possible world.
And also in Quran we have...
in the same way that the categories, Allah is outside of the categories. So don't put God in the categories. He's outside of the categories.
In Quran we have Allah khaliqu kulla shay. Allah is
yeah, He created everything. He's al-Khaliq al-Bari al-Musawwir.
All these are things, maybe.
They're things.
That's why.
Yeah, He is. He's the creator. But He doesn't create them in the way that we make things.
Of course.
Humans, we do sana'a.
Sana, exactly.
Yeah, Allah does khalq. Khalq is ijad. Humans, in Arabic, in proper Arabic, you don't say Zayd khalaqa hada.
No.
You say sana'ahu. Which is why some of the ulama reject using sani'. If you notice, the Ibn Rushd will use sani'. And a lot of, like Ibn Sina uses sani' for Allah. And that's problematic because even though the reason it's problematic is because it's not one of his 99 names or even the 121 names that are mentioned in the Quran, either directly or by ishtiqaq. But the problem with it is that it indicates a pre-existing material. So the philosophers believed in the eternity of the world. And they believed that the Creator was coexistent with the world. And that what the Creator did was He made order out of chaos. And this is the problem of cause and effect. I mean, we're getting into philosophy, and I don't really want to do that right now, but so we'll just leave it at that. Yeah. Any other questions?
Could you clarify what an accident is? Like how a triangle being equilateral is not a quality, but an accident?
Okay, yeah. So they're both accidents. The property is an accident also, but it's an accident that flows from the essence. So part of, and these, again, you know, these are ways of understanding, and you don't want to, harakan mutanatti'un. If you keep pushing the thing, it begins to break down. And that's the nature of thought. It's got its limitations. And even in these definitions, you will find much debate about, like Ibn Taymiyyah rejected the difference between a khasa and a fasl. You know, he said, you know, that's just wordplay. But there is a difference, and these things are, I think they're real, but they do have their limitations. So determining the difference between a fasl and a khasa is not always that easy to determine what is the essential difference and what is a property. I'll give you an example. If we're going to define religion, religion is a genus, right? And religion, I had in a class I had at the university, we read 4 books, all arguing that there was no such thing as religion. I mean, literally, just that was the argument. And there's people that believe that, you know, philosophers that believe that you can, you know, this whole idea. But that's the problem of nominalism. Like they don't believe in essences, that things have essences. And so if you accept the idea of religion, that there is something that has an essence that we call religion, then you can define the religion. So the genus of religion has different types. There's species of religion. So Judaism is a species of religion. Christianity is a species. Buddhism, arguably, some will say it's philosophy. Hinduism, arguably, some again will say it's something else. Muslims often don't like the term religion. They say we're not a religion, we're a way of life. You know, it's a millah. I mean, traditionally they call them milal. And so millah is probably the closest Arabic word that we have, or deen also, because there are other deens. But if you look, what would you say the difference of Christianity is? If the genus is religion, what's the difference?
The way it's practiced?
No, I'm talking about, we're trying to define Christianity. So what would be an essential difference between Christianity and all other religions that make it... You think so, Trinity? I mean, I would go with that argument. That's what I would say. I would say the essential difference is vicarious atonement. Because that is That's what Christianity is all about. Jesus died for your sins. And if you get that, you got the whole thing, right? That really defines the religion of Christianity. And they would argue that as long as you accept that, justified sinning, you know, you can do, I mean, they don't say this, and it's not fair to Christians to say that, you know, because they don't. But there is a concept in a certain type of Christianity of justified sinning, which is basically that we're all sinners, you know, and we just try your best, but God died for your sins. So in the end, it's okay. Right? That's justified sinning. So that, I would say, is it, that Jesus died for your sins. That's the real difference, vicarious atonement. So, and then the species we would call Christianity. So what would be the difference of Islam? What do you think? Tawheed? I mean, it's called Islam. You know, it's not called Tawheed. So Tawheed would be a khasa. It's a property that flows from the essence of the religion, but the real essence of the religion is submission, because part of the submission is accepting Tawheed, right? So, I mean, that's what I would think. We could, again, these are not fixed in stone. They really aren't. They're ways of definition, and definitions, we'll get to it, are one of the hardest things in logic. But if you define things well, it really helps in understanding and discussion. So,
Assalamu alaikum. I think the whole sort of introduction to logic has got me thinking that, me personally, I don't know how to think, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, you do know how to think.
No, but
yeah, in the same way you know how to speak, but you might not have studied grammar. So
yeah.
You're going to make mistakes, or you might wonder, you know, what does that sentence mean? Whereas if you knew grammar and understood that there's a reason why he's using the pluperfect tense, or there's a reason why it's in a conditional construct, or that's actually a dependent clause, or hey, that's a dangling modifier. If you know those things, it enables you to better understand what you're reading.
No, of course. But I mean, as Muslims, when we're young, we're always taught that the Prophet is truthful, he's right, and everything.
Yeah.
But as we're like young kids, we don't truly get the essence of that.
Right.
So there was a talk on TEDx by Leslie Hazeltine,
Yeah,
and she's an agnostic Jew, and she said the reason that the message is truthful for her was because his response as a human was so rational. So I mean,
this is one of the most appealing aspects of Islam historically, is that it made sense to people. Yeah. It's called Deen al-Fitra. And this is one of the things that it doesn't offend the intellect. Now, obviously, somebody like Dawkins would say, you know, riding on a magical horse offends my intellect. And he'll often use that in his debates. And if those of you who saw the debate with the journalist from the Jazeera, who did a relatively good job, but I would not send a journalist to do a theologian's job. The response to him, what should have been, I think, is that first of all, that is not an article of faith to believe that that was a literal, physical event. In fact, scholars are in absolute agreement, with the exception of a very, very small heterodoxic group. But Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah are in agreement that the night visit from Jerusalem into the heavens was not a temporo-spatial visit. It was in another realm. Because Allah, you don't go to, you know, God's house you can go to in Mecca, but you cannot go to a place where God is. So, you know, the response to him at that point was, and it was good that he said that he believed that, because we have to believe that. And our scholars say that things are to be taken literal before they're taken metaphorically. In other words, أصل الكلام الحقيقة إلا أن يصرفه صارف. So the foundation of language, when the Quran says something, we should take it literal, unless there's a reason why it should be interpreted metaphorically. And there is metaphor. The idea that there's not isti'ara in the Quran is completely insane. And the people that deny isti'ara in the Quran are really denying something so fundamental to language, and certainly to the language of the Arabs. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ used metaphor all the time. The Quran uses metaphor. The Quran says, وَمَنْ كَانَ فِي حَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا أَعْمَى فَهُوَ فِي الْآخِرَةِ أَعْمَى وَأَضَلُّ سَبِيلًا. You know, the one who in this life is blind will be blind in the next life. That can't be literal. Huh? What's that?
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. If traditional logic, which was used previously, I understand, with people of faith, Christians and other people of faith, Jews possibly, nowadays we're debating atheists generally, and their reality is different to our reality. So how does that work?
The new atheists are actually far less formidable than the old atheists. And if you want to read a really good atheist, you know, Nietzsche is much more interesting than Hitchens or Dawkins or Dennett or Sam Harris. I mean, Nietzsche at least thought the thing through. You know, because he said, hold on, we're on for a real ride. He said it's going to get so dark if we can't transcend this thing, right? The transvaluation of values, the Übermensch. You know, I mean, he was arguing that when you remove God, you remove the ground of being. And we have to become gods ourselves in order to deal with that. So, I mean, these people are very glib, in my estimation. But people forget. There have been atheists always. I mean, there have always been people that have had a hard time with belief in God. And so the same problems arise. Dawr and tasalsul. You can't get around infinite regress and circularity. I mean, these are all the same issues. It's not that different. Trust me. I mean, I really... Don't trust me. Learn for yourself. Study for yourself. And, you know, I mean, taqleed is a, you know, taqleed is not a good state to be in, you know, to be a blind follower or an imitator of, I mean, one of the things, you know, what's really interesting to me is the Muslims had no interest in proving the existence of God. Their obsession was proving the prophecy of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All their books are about proving he was a prophet. Because if you prove he was a prophet, ipso facto, there must be a God because he sent him. So their whole thing was to prove, I mean, Imam al-Bayhaqi wrote a huge multi-volume work called Dalail al-Nubuwwah. And he said, here's the proof that he's a prophet. The Prophet ﷺ predicted many, many things that have come true. That in the 7th century in Arabia, it just would not have been possible to predict those things, or they wouldn't even occur to people. And people say, well, Nostradamus did that, so what, is he a prophet? I mean, the predictions of Nostradamus are so obscure. And anyway, there's an argument that he had access to certain Jewish tradition, because they have the signs of the end of time as well. So it's not, you know, there are definitely signs that have not come. And all the Buddhists have signs of the end of time, the Hindus have signs, the Kali Yuga age, you know, the Hindus talk about the signs when children will no longer obey their parents. I mean, parents have always had trouble with children, but not like today. I mean, something is very different, which doesn't mean the end of time's around the corner. You know, I'm not suggesting that, and I think that's a dangerous approach to take, but it's certainly closer than it was 1,400 years ago. and arguably much closer. And there are many signs that should be troubling to people. The Prophet predicted same-sex marriage. I mean, that's a sound hadith. He said the end of time will not come until a man marries a man and a woman marries a woman. And we have no evidence in human history that that was ever, we have no evidence that any culture has ever sanctioned same-sex marriage. But he said it will be one of the signs of the end of time. He said you will see nikah al-rajul al-rajul, wa nikah al-mar'ati al-mar'a. And nikah here means clearly marriage, because homosexuality existed, so he wasn't talking about homosexuality or musahaqa. He was talking about marriage. So, you know, he predicted that the buildings of Mecca would surpass the mountains. Who could have thought of that in the 7th century of Arabia? Who could have thought of that? He predicted that people would fly in the air. He predicted that people would go out of their houses with things on their thighs that would tell them what was happening back in their families. He said that people would talk to shiraku na'alihi, which in Arabic, shiraku na'al is this. That is what a shiraku na'ali, which is the universal sign today for telephone. And he said a man will talk to his shiraku na'al. You know, that's how people say it, right? The Arabs call that shiraku na'al. Is Imam Jamal here? Dahabi? Is he here? He went? Yeah. So all of those are aspects of the Prophet. And then the fact that he was predicted by previous revelations. I mean, he's predicted in the Dhammapada. There's a Hindu professor that proved that he was predicted in the scriptures in Sanskrit. I mean, he wrote a whole book on the Kalki avatar. And he didn't become Muslim. That's what's so weird about it. But he said it could be nobody else but Muhammad. It has to be him. You know, so he was predicted in the Old Testament. What was Salman al-Farisi doing in Arabia? He was looking for the last prophet. He'd been told about him. Why were the Jews in Yathrib? And there's a lot of nice places to live for the Jews at that time. I mean, they came from Sham. Why would they live in Yathrib, middle of the Arabian desert? Because they actually believed that the last prophet was coming from that place. There were rabbis in Yemen who knew that he was coming. 80 years before the prophet was born, there was a Yemeni chieftain that tried to take over Medina, and when he found out it was the place of the last prophet, he made a waqf, which is where the prophet's house was. And he said, I want this to be where that prophet lives. I mean, these are all recorded. The Prophet ﷺ predicted the Baghdad is predicted, the circular city that would be destroyed, many, many things. So, you know, in the end, man sha'a falyu'min, whoever wants, let him believe. Wa man sha'a falyakfur, whoever wants, let him disbelieve. It's a choice. In the end of the day, it is a choice. Let people believe, let them disbelieve. You know, it's a choice. What we should strive for is common weal, right? We should have even secular values, acknowledge common weal. Iceland outlawed pornography, not because of any religious instinct, because it's a very secular country, but they just said it doesn't promote the common good. And it's a very highly educated middle-class culture. And pornography tends to be uneducated people are the consumers of pornography, or very, very deviant, cosmopolitan type people that are jejun. You know, the nafs is just so sick that, you know, Hugh Hefner syndrome.
Sorry, can we wait for the mic? So everyone can hear the question? And this will be the last question.
All right.
Sorry, just wondering whether reason and logic is the same thing,
Right.
and if it's the same as aqal. And there's this verse. I mean, I don't know much, but there's a verse in the Quran which says something about either use your aqal or turn to the scriptures. So maybe if you could just maybe say a few things about that.
Yeah. The reason, logic as a technical term comes from a Greek word logos. In Latin, it's they use the word ratio, which is where we get rationality from. Ratio is a proportion. So like 2 to 1 is a ratio. So this city is twice as big as this city. That's something the intellect does. That's reasoning, analogical reasoning. So you're taking one thing and using it as an analogy for another thing. So that thing that we do naturally has been codified and articulated in a way that helps people do it better. What we do naturally, logic helps you to do better. So logic as a technical term is the art of reasoning. It's the science of reasoning. Aqal in Arabic, there are many words for that meaning. One of them is furqan, which is very similar to the word intellect. وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ فُرْقَانًا. The one who has taqwa, God will give him a furqan. The furqan is the ability to discriminate between things. And that in Latin is called intellectus. Intellectus means to judge between things, right? So judging between things, that's the essence of what the intellect does. And that's called, in logic, it's called tasdeeq in Arabic, which is judgment, or assent, or hukm ala shay, right? And then in English we call it judgment. And that's the second component of logic, after understanding, just grasping something. So in logic, what the human mind is always doing, it's grasping what a thing is. So that picture, I understand what a picture is because I grasp its essence. I've abstracted it. In Arabic, it's called tajrid, ujarriduhu. Ujarriduhu means to make it naked, to denude it of its attributes. So you remove the accidents and you see the essence. That's what abstraction is. Once I get the essence, anytime I see a picture, I say, that's a picture. Even though it's not the same. It might even be different. But if it has the same essence of the picture, so that's the simple apprehension. That's understanding. We all do that naturally. Animals don't do that, as far as we know. If they do it, they don't articulate it. But they're not sitting around saying, what kind of a picture do you think that is? The two gophers. I think they use it for lemonade. No, I think that's a beer pitcher. As far as we know, no animals are doing that. But there is mantiq, tayr, and Suleiman was taught the logic of the animals. So they're communicating at some level. But as far as we know, they're not abstracting. Angels intuitively get it. They don't need to abstract. They have immediate knowledge. Humans don't. Their knowledge is mediated. And the first mediation is the abstraction. And as far as we know, angels aren't doing that. Which I'll get into that when we get into terms about Allama Adam al-Asma, because Fakhruddin al-Razi makes a very good argument for why what we do is different from what the angels do. And that's certainly the Christian view also in the Catholic tradition. So the intellect is also called aqal. Now aqala means to restrain. So the intellect is the thing that restrains you from going astray. It prevents you. So afala ta'qilun, don't you use your intellect. Ya'qilu al-ba'ir means to hobble the camel. And the iqal, what the desert Arabs wear on their head, you know, in Saudi Arabia, they have that thing on their head. That comes from their Bedouin past. It's called the iqal. The iqal it's a mushtaq of aqal, because it does to the camel what the intellect does to the human. The iqal is there to make sure that the camel doesn't go astray. The aql is there to make sure that you don't go astray. So humans go astray when they stop using their intellect, or when they use it improperly. And we'll get into that, just about what's called real goods and apparent goods. In all the Abrahamic languages, the word for sin, to sin, means to miss the mark. It's an archery term. Armatia in New Testament Greek, right? In Hebrew and in Arabic, khati'ah, which is it's a akhta'tu al-marma. Khati'ah is an archery term, to miss the mark. And the idea that sin is missing the target of good, because you thought you were getting a good. When people sin, they're trying to get something that they think is going to be good for them, or they wouldn't do it. Everybody, that's why we're all rational. Even when people sin, they sin for rational reasons. I mean, if somebody kills somebody, unless they're mad, they have a reason for doing it. I mean, even Dahmer, you know, this guy, for people who are fortunate not to know who he was. But in America, we had this guy that was eating kids, you know. But he was a Satanist. He worshipped Satan, and he believed that, you know, that he was getting some kind of power in doing that. So there was some reason for why he did that. But people go astray, and they can go really astray. But they always think that what they're doing is the right thing. So they miss the mark. That's why sinning is missing the mark. And that's what the intellect and revelation enable you to see the mark. And to aim for what's right action, to do the right thing in any given situation. Sometimes it's ijtihad, what's the right thing. Imam Umar, radiallahu anhu, he suspended the had punishment during the famine, because he said it's inappropriate to implement a punishment on people when they're only doing what they're doing out of necessity. So there he was using his intellect, his aql, to apply a hukm shar'i that in normal circumstances would have been one thing, but he was saying, in this one, I think it's this. So he was using his intellect, and he's called Faruq, the one who distinguishes between right and wrong. And he had a brilliant mind. I mean, Sayyidina Umar is a great logician, but he didn't need formal logic. In the same way, he was a great Arabic master, and he didn't know formal grammar. I mean, Umar didn't know fa'il and maf'ul bihi and, you know, makhfud bi nazar khafid. He didn't know any of those things. Go ahead. Yeah. What's the mic? Okay. Last question, I think Sadaf said. So we'll give the men a chance.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
Can you please explain the difference between deduction and induction, and the idea that in Islam we are more in induction? And if you can give an example in fiqh.
Okay.
Please.
All right. Well, in the Islamic tradition, the argument of most of the scholars, particularly after Imam al-Ghazali, deduction was very important, which is arguing from universals to particulars. Maqasid al-Sharia is based on universals. So like what Omar did was he was using deduction rather than induction in his application. His reasoning would have been the Sharia is for the good of people, right? And in times of necessity, people do things that they would not normally do. Therefore, in times of necessity, we can't, the maslahah for the people would be different from normal times. Something like that. So, you know, at the most simplistic level, deduction is going from a general to a particular. An example of that would be I mean, the classic example that's always given in all the books of logic is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a deduction. But deduction works because of under simple apprehension, abstraction of essences. There is an argument, and this is a later argument when you get into Francis Bacon, John Stuart Mill, and Ibn Taymiyyah makes this argument also before them. So he's actually earlier. There's an argument that you can only know that by deduction, by induction, which is to go from particulars to derive from particular examples some kind of universal. So for instance, I noticed Zayd died, and then Amr died, and then Abdullah died, and they're all men. Therefore, it looks like men die. Well, the argument against that is the Black Swan argument, which is to say, you don't know that all men die. You're making that assumption because it appears that everybody dies. But there might be immortals walking the earth. The Greeks believed in immortals. The Taoists, some of the Taoists believed in the immortals. What's that? What's that? Immortal is Khalid. Somebody doesn't die. Like some Muslims believe in al-Khidr as an immortal, and the Jews and some Muslims also believe Elijah is an immortal. I mean, they will die eventually when everybody dies, but they have a longevity. According to the people that adhere, that's a khilaf issue. But if you understand the essence of what it is to be an animal, you will understand that all animals die. It's essential to the nature of an animal. And so that's abstracting in essence. Once you've abstracted the essence, then you can make deductions about that. So that's the argument for deductive reasoning. Anyway, we'll get into that when we get into. So I know it's kind of because we use these terms even in common language, and they come out of sciences that need studying. But that's basically an example in fiqh would be kullu muskirin haram. Right? Every muskir is haram. That's a universal statement. Cocaine is a muskir. Or if you want to get into, fuqaha classified them as murqidat, mufsidat, and muskirat. And they would put cocaine as a mufsidat. But it's basically goes under the same ruling by analogy, by qiyas. And it's a deductive because the kulliya is everything that affects the intellect is in a way of iskar or takhmir, yukhamiru. Like khamar is yughatti al-aql. The women wear a khimar, right? Because it covers the head. Khamar is a isti'ara. It's a metaphor taken from khamara, to cover. And so it's because it covers the intellect. It overwhelms you. So by deductive reasoning, any particular example of that universal rule would go under the same category. So that's an example. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah would argue that's just qiyas by ashbah, when nadha'ir. You're just looking analogically. It's not really deduction. So that's his argument. I mean, he has an argument against it, and a lot of the modern philosophers will make those arguments as well. Is that clear? Not really? Sorry. Alhamdulillah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.